Welcome to this explainer. We're jumping right into the cinematic dawn of what is absolutely, hands down, the most important era in English literature. Look, whether you're prepping for your BA, your MA, UGC Net, or really any major competitive lit exam, you've got to have a rock-solid foundation of how this era actually kicked off. Today, we're zooming in on that exact moment the world finally woke up from the Middle Ages and triggered a massive cultural explosion, one that gave us literally the greatest writers in history.
Let's ground ourselves in the timeline right out of the gate. We are transitioning out of the Middle English period, which ran from 1066 to roughly 1500, and stepping across the threshold into a monumental 160-year span. I mean, really think about that for a second. Just over 5 generations completely rewrote the rules of art and society. This Renaissance period stretches from 1500 to 1660, encompassing the Elizabethan and Jacobean ages, and it completely changed the world, setting the entire stage for modern literature as we know it today.
So, to tackle all of this, we're going to run through a quick roadmap today. First, we'll hit the true meaning of rebirth, then look at the massive engines of change driving it. After that, we'll do a quick medieval versus Renaissance comparison, track the movement's arrival in England, and finally, map out the Golden Age roadmap. Let's get right into it. Kicking things off with Part 1, the meaning of rebirth. We really have to start with the fundamental terminology that defines this entire period. The word Renaissance literally translates to rebirth, and that's exactly what it was. After centuries of, intellectual stagnation, society essentially blew the dust off the classical wisdom of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Scholars were literally raiding old monasteries looking for lost, forgotten manuscripts. It wasn't just some minor shift in artistic style. This was an explosive revival of intellectual and creative energy that entirely changed how humanity viewed itself, and honestly, its own potential.
Moving right along to Part 2, the engines of change. Because a rebirth on this massive, unprecedented scale doesn't just happen out of nowhere, right? It needs some serious catalysts.
This whole movement certainly didn't happen overnight. It actually began as a spark over in Italy, driven conceptually by a brand new philosophy known as humanism. Then that philosophy was put into absolute hyperdrive by a revolutionary piece of technology, the printing press, before it eventually migrated across the channel and landed on English shores.
Let's talk about humanism for a second. Before this point, medieval society pretty much viewed life as just a waiting room for the afterlife. But humanism, it radically shifted the spotlight straight onto the individual. It championed human intellect, human agency, and our achievements in the here and now. The message was clear: you matter, and what you create matters. It was a completely game-changing way of thinking that prioritized the actual human experience.
But as we know, an idea can really only travel so fast by word of mouth. That's where the printing press comes in. This was literally the internet of the 15th century. Instead of monks painstakingly copying manuscripts by hand in total isolation for years at a time, texts were suddenly being reproduced rapidly and shared across borders. It democratized knowledge at a speed and scale the world had never seen, basically pouring absolute gasoline on that humanist fire.
All right, into Part 3, comparing the medieval versus the Renaissance era. If you're mapping out your study plan for competitive exams, you'll want to pay really close attention to this specific cultural shift.
It boils down to a stark contrast. The medieval era was totally defined by rigid social structures and this overwhelming, all-consuming focus on the divine. The Renaissance came in and completely broke those chains. It championed individualism and celebrated new exploration in every sense, from mapping the physical globe to literally mapping human anatomy. The rigid, uniform collective gave way to the vibrant, curious individual.
Which brings us to Part 4, the arrival in England. Once this intellectual fire began sweeping across Europe, it was inevitable that it would cross the English Channel.
When the Renaissance finally reached England, it beautifully coincided with the start of the Tudor dynasty. After the chaotic and honestly pretty bloody reigns of Henry VII and Henry VIII, alongside the massive upheaval of the religious Reformation, things finally started to settle down under Queen Elizabeth I. And why does that matter so much to us as literature students? Because art requires peace to thrive. Elizabeth's political stability created the absolute perfect environment for an unprecedented explosion of literature.
Now for our final section, Part 5, the Golden Age roadmap. This arrival in England sets the ultimate stage for the creativity we'll be exploring.
This cultural rebirth produced what is essentially your ultimate blueprint for English literature. We get the golden age of poetry with the sonnet traditions of Petrarch, Wyatt, Surrey, and Spenser. We get the absolute unmatched brilliance of William Shakespeare and his Globe Theatre, standing right alongside giant playwrights like Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson. Plus, we see the monumental rise of English prose through thinkers like Francis Bacon and Philip Sidney, which all culminates in the massive 1611 translation of the King James Bible.
These writers didn't just write great stories. They permanently embedded deep, complex themes of classicism, revenge, ambition, and heroism right into our cultural DNA. It was a profound transition that forever changed the landscape of world literature, acting as the ultimate bridge that would eventually carry us into the metaphysical age.
All of this leaves us with a really fascinating final thought to prepare you for the rest of this Explainer series. How exactly did a simple philosophical shift, a rebirth of classical ideas over in Italy, end up giving us the greatest playwright in English history, William Shakespeare? Keep that incredible chain reaction, from humanism to the printing press to Elizabeth's England, in mind. It's like a giant puzzle coming together. I'll see you in our next Explainer as we dive even deeper into the English Renaissance.
Welcome to this Explainer. Jump right in with me for a second and picture this. A country completely exhausted, bleeding out from a brutal civil conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. We're talking about 16th century England. Now imagine that same war-torn country emerging just a few decades later as a literal cultural beacon of political stability, scientific advancement, and artistic awakening. How does a country pull off a 180 like that? Well, it all comes down to the Tudor dynasty. Today, we're going to see exactly how this specific, incredibly dramatic sequence of monarchs completely transformed England, acting as the perfect incubator for the English Renaissance and ultimately paving the way for a golden age of literature. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the dawn of the Tudors, move through the English Reformation, navigate a totally divided nation, bask in Elizabeth's golden age, and finally unpack that huge literary explosion. Before we really get into the weeds, let's nail down what we actually mean by the English Renaissance. We're looking at a very specific period in 16th century England. It was an era where art, science, and especially literature just flourished in a way the nation had literally never seen before. We see global exploration expanding the known world and intellectual growth just absolutely skyrocketing. But, a cultural explosion like this doesn't just happen out of nowhere. It required a rock-solid political foundation. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the dawn of the Tudors and that crucial foundation of peace. Our story really kicks off in 1485. That's the year the incredibly long and bloody civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York finally wrapped up. Henry Tudor takes down King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, crowns himself King Henry VII, and boom, the Tudor dynasty is officially born. Now, why does this matter? Well, his reign effectively hit the reset button. He restored peace and really strengthened the monarchy. This brand new stability totally revitalized the economy and blew trade wide open. For the first time in ages, England could finally take a deep breath. And that deep breath, that's what made them ready for the massive intellectual growth of the Renaissance. Moving right along to Section 2, let's look at the English Reformation, or as I like to think of it, Henry VIII's incredible upheaval. The absolute turning point here is the year 1534. Henry VIII fundamentally rewired the nation's entire religious and political landscape forever. After a pretty legendary dispute with the Pope, Henry basically said, "I'm out," and established the Church of England through the Act of Supremacy. He literally made himself the supreme head of the church. And this wasn't just some minor religious tweak. This was a gigantic transfer of absolute power and wealth. This decision kicked off a huge domino effect across the country. By breaking from the Pope, monasteries all over England were completely dissolved, and a staggering amount of church wealth was funneled directly to the crown. But here's the really interesting part. This massive shakeup actually ended up encouraging brand new educational ideas. Even more importantly, it pushed a huge shift toward using the English language in religious life, rather than just sticking to Latin. So the Reformation becomes this defining moment for the Renaissance because it started centralizing not just resources, but the English language itself. Which brings us to Section 3, a nation divided and a pretty intense religious pendulum swing. Right after Henry dies, the country gets ideological whiplash. First, his young son, Edward VI, steps up and doubles down on Protestant reforms. He pushes English even further into church services and gives immense importance to the Book of Common Prayer. But his reign was short. When his sister Mary I takes over, she does a complete 180, attempting a full-throttle Roman Catholic restoration. She persecuted Protestants so intensely that history remembers her as Bloody Mary. And while her reign was also brief, it really highlights the intense, often violent religious anxiety that was constantly shaping the minds of Renaissance thinkers at the time. Let's pivot to Section 4, Elizabeth's Golden Age, where we finally see an era of compromise. Right out of that violent whiplash steps Queen Elizabeth I. She takes the throne in 1558 and ends up ruling for 45 years. 45 years. Just think about what that kind of long-term consistency means for a country that had been violently bouncing between absolute extremes. Elizabeth brought back political stability and, crucially, she championed religious compromise. It's exactly this extended 45-year stretch of peace and steady leadership that we now look back on as England's golden age. And that newfound domestic peace, it was soon locked down on a global scale. In 1588, England managed to defeat the Spanish Armada. This was a game-changing victory that firmly stamped England on the map as a major European powerhouse. With the seas finally safe for English vessels, trade and exploration just exploded. English merchant ships were reaching distant continents, and they brought back incredible wealth, entirely new perspectives, and this undeniable sense of national invincibility. But Elizabeth wasn't just about building a strong navy, she was an absolutely massive patron of the arts. Her royal backing led to flourishing public theaters and completely transformed English drama. We're talking about creating the perfect incubator that gave rise to absolute legends like William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and Ben Jonson. The art produced under her rule was so magnificent that the English Renaissance is very often just referred to as the Elizabethan Age. So, having walked through this timeline of political stability and royal support, we really have to ask ourselves, why exactly did this specific environment trigger such an incredible literary explosion? What were the cultural gears turning behind the scenes that allowed guys like Shakespeare and Marlowe to just absolutely thrive? Let's unpack that in our fifth and final section, the literary explosion and its cultural catalysts. This whole thing built step by step into a literal cultural revolution. Step 1 was technology. The printing press meant books were finally widely available. Information wasn't just locked away in some dusty, hand-copied manuscript anymore. Step 2, humanism. This new philosophy started spreading like wildfire, encouraging critical thinking and deep creativity everywhere. Step 3, with books available and education shifting, expanding literacy created this massive, eager market of brand new readers. And finally, Step 4, the real game changer. English officially replaced Latin and French as the language of literature. For the very first time, high art belonged to ordinary people, not just aristocratic scholars. Thanks to the general prosperity of Elizabeth's reign, artists and writers actually had the breathing room to focus entirely on their craft. Theaters became the ultimate public gathering spaces. Think about the Globe Theater. This was a place where audiences from every single social class rubbed shoulders. You literally had commoners standing down in the pit, nobles sitting up in the balconies, and they were all absorbing the exact same English masterpieces at the exact same time. It was an unprecedented mixing of society, completely driven by art. Now, we have to remember England wasn't operating in a vacuum here. They were enthusiastically embracing a much wider European movement. Through trade and travel, fresh ideas from Italy, France, and the Netherlands were just pouring into London. English writers were finding profound inspiration in classical Greek and Roman literature, blending their own medieval traditions with ancient wisdom. You combine that with the new cultural perspectives coming off those merchant ships exploring the globe, and you've got the perfect storm of innovation defining Renaissance literature. The Tudor dynasty totally transformed the nation. They took a fractured, bleeding, war-torn state, and through sheer political stability, religious reform, and exploration, they built the perfect launchpad for literary greatness. Which brings us to a final question for you to ponder today. With this rock-solid foundation of peace and prosperity now set, how exactly did poets like Sir Thomas Wyatt, Henry Howard, and Edmund Spenser use it to revolutionize English verse and introduce the modern sonnet to the world? Well, that incredible blend of innovation and art is going to be the focus of our next explainer on the birth of Renaissance poetry. Until then, keep exploring, and thanks for joining me today. Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we're diving into a period in history that didn't just tweak politics and society, it absolutely fundamentally revolutionized English poetry. We are talking a literal game changer. Between the years 1500 and 1660, English poets did something pretty unprecedented. They looked beyond their own shores, they looked outward for inspiration, and they discovered this incredible, rich literature of ancient Greece, Rome, and Renaissance Italy. And through this outward gaze, they started experimenting with entirely new forms. They celebrated beauty, love, and human ambition, and ultimately, they gave English poetry a completely new voice. So that brings us to a really fascinating question. How exactly did English poetry find that modern voice? It wasn't just some overnight accident. What we're going to trace today is essentially a historical relay race. We're looking at a chronological passing of the torch from one pioneering poet right to the next. It's this incredible journey of innovation and refinement that would eventually lay the absolute perfect foundation for the genius of William Shakespeare. But, well, to understand how we got to Shakespeare, we really have to start at the beginning of this whole transformation. Section 1. Dawn of Renaissance Poetry. Moving beyond the medieval. Right, so before the Renaissance, English poetry was heavily influenced by medieval traditions, right? It focused almost exclusively on religion, morality, and chivalry. But then came humanism, and humanism was this massive movement that shifted the focus to celebrating human emotions and the raw, unpolished beauty of the natural world. Actually, scratch that. It wasn't a sudden shift at all. Let's move to and see how this builds, because it really built across time and geography. It started way back in the classical era with ancient writers like Virgil, Ovid, and Horace, before making its way to 14th century Italy with the highly elegant pioneer Francesco Petrarch. And from there, those classical roots finally crossed the channel and landed in 16th century England. Section 2. Sir Thomas Wyatt, the Pioneer. 14. So Sir Thomas Wyatt, he was a diplomat in King Henry VIII's court and, fun fact, rumored to be an early suitor of Anne Boleyn. He actually traveled to Italy, and while he was there, he was so profoundly inspired by Petrarch's poetry that he brought the 14-line sonnet back home and completely adapted it for the English language. He took these 14 lines and used them to explore deeply personal inner conflicts and, the extremely messy, dangerous complexities of Tudor courtly life. Now, sure, his style was considered a little simple compared to the writers who came after him, but Wyatt, he literally kicked open the door to a brand new era. Which leads us to a massive what-if in literary history. Like, what would Shakespeare actually sound like without blank verse? The truth is, without the innovations of our very next poet, Shakespeare's great plays might never have had the auditory rhythm we all know today. That incredibly famous cadence of English drama, it wasn't invented by Shakespeare himself. It was invented by the guy who grabbed the baton directly from Sir Thomas Wyatt. Section 3. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, Refining the Craft. So, taking that baton from Wyatt, the Earl of Surrey aggressively refined the craft. He smoothed out all the rough edges to make the rhythm far more natural for the English tongue. And his most revolutionary contribution, for sure, was introducing what we now call blank verse, that is, poetry written in unrhymed iambic pentameter. By ditching the super strict requirement to rhyme, but keeping that steady, heartbeat-like rhythm, Surrey engineered the absolute bedrock foundation of English drama. He struck this completely perfect balance between poetic elevation and just natural human speech. Section 4. The Sonnet Tradition, a Structural Evolution. And this brilliantly illustrates how the sonnet evolved internally as it became the fashionable way to write about things like love, time, and philosophy. Look at this. Wyatt's Petrarchan adaptation used an octave, followed by a sestet, but Surrey engineered the English sonnet, 3 quatrains, followed by a final punchy couplet. This precise structural formula is exactly what William Shakespeare would eventually adopt and perfect, even though, as we just saw, Surrey is the one who actually invented it. The poet's poet. Wow. I mean, that is a title of sheer, undeniable reverence. If Wyatt introduced the forms and Surrey refined them, the man known as the poet's poet elevated the whole shebang to pure, undisputed greatness. He ended up inspiring not just readers, but entire generations of master poets. Section 5. Edmund Spenser, Expanding the Imagination. So Edmund Spenser, he expanded English verse to these sweeping, epic proportions with his massive masterpiece, The Faerie Queene. We're talking vast fantasy landscapes here, knights, castles, totally immersive fairy kingdoms.
And through all of that, Spenser crafted these incredibly deep allegories. He explicitly celebrated virtues like holiness, temperance, chastity, friendship, justice, and courtesy. Why? To embody the absolute highest ideals of the Elizabethan age. It was poetry pulling double duty, acting as immense, thrilling entertainment, but also as a really profound moral compass.
9. Because to pull off this massive epic, Spenser had to invent his own form, the 9-line Spenserian stanza, which is locked into this highly unique, really complex rhyme scheme. It allowed for this rich, incredibly musical language, and it was so effective it went on to inspire heavyweights of English literature. I'm talking Milton, Keats, Shelley, and Tennyson for literal centuries to come. To put that into perspective, he basically built a new poetic technology that changed the game forever.
Section 6. The Legacy. Paving the way for Shakespeare. So you can see why this collaborative evolution was truly the golden age of poetry. It's like a giant puzzle coming together. Wyatt boldly brought the forms over from Italy. Surrey refined the language into blank verse. And Spenser, he completely expanded the imagination. By stepping away from those rigid, strictly moralistic medieval traditions, these three men completely transformed English verse. They brought in richer language, deeper emotions. Ultimately, they gave poetry a pulse, turning it into a powerful, living reflection of the human spirit. So the forms were introduced, the language was refined, the imagination was expanded, the stage is officially set, which leaves us with one final thrilling question to ponder. Who is ready to step onto this perfectly prepared stage and become the greatest writer in the history of English literature? The Renaissance journey definitely doesn't end here. It's really just getting to the main event. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep that curiosity alive.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're dissecting the actual DNA of modern storytelling by looking at the man who, well, practically invented it, William Shakespeare. We're going to explore the absolutely remarkable story of a figure who fundamentally changed the way we communicate, completely transforming drama, poetry, and storytelling forever. So let's jump right into the life of the Bard of Avon. Now, to call anyone the greatest writer in the history of the English language is a massive, incredibly bold claim, right? But it's a claim backed up by over 4 centuries of continuous global obsession. I mean, it's been over 400 years since he lived, and yet his plays are still being performed across the entire world literally every single day. The crazy part is that the characters he created way back in Elizabethan England still feel remarkably, and sometimes uncomfortably, real to us today.
To understand exactly how this glovemaker's son achieved absolute literary immortality, we have to look at the incredibly brief window of time he had to actually do it. From his birth in 1564 to his death in 1616, we're going to trace how a seemingly ordinary boy from a quiet market town rose up to become the defining voice of an entire era.
So, our story begins in the ordinary world of 1564, right in the picturesque market town of Stratford-upon-Avon, surrounded by the English countryside. William was born to John Shakespeare, who was a highly successful glovemaker and local official, and Mary Arden, a woman from a really well-respected farming family. You know, this middle-class background is actually a fascinating piece of the puzzle. Unlike a lot of his peer playwrights, those guys often called the university wits who had super wealthy aristocratic upbringings, Shakespeare wasn't born into high society. This uniquely grounded perspective would profoundly shape that wide-ranging empathy we see in his later writing.
Now, while we actually know very little about his day-to-day childhood, his likely attendance at the King's New School is absolutely the key to his genius. He wasn't just learning to read here. He was steeped in Latin, grammar, classical literature, rhetoric, and history. He was literally studying the mechanics of profound communication, arming himself with the exact literary tools he later used to craft his absolute masterpieces.
The next major milestone hits in 1582, and it comes with a bit of a historical plot twist. At just 18 years old, Shakespeare gets married to Anne Hathaway. The surprising part? She was 8 years older than him. Together, the couple quickly started a family, having 3 children, Susanna and twins Hamnet and Judith. At this point, it really seemed like the beginning of a quiet, traditional life in the country.
But then, we hit a wall. Shakespeare just completely disappears from historical records for several years. Historians call this mysterious period the lost years. So, what was he doing? Well, some believe he worked as a schoolteacher. Others suggest he might have traveled around, or perhaps ran off to join a traveling theatrical company. The truth is, nobody knows for sure. But whatever he was doing out there in the unknown, it was clearly preparing him for the biggest stage of all.
When he finally resurfaces in the early 1590s, he has arrived in the bustling, vibrant metropolis of London. And he isn't just surviving. He's become a highly successful actor and playwright for a celebrated company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which would later become the King's Men. But here's the crucial insight. He wasn't just a hired writer. He became a shareholder in the company. That gave him a level of financial stability and creative freedom that most freelance playwrights of his time simply did not have. He had finally found his people, and he had secured his platform.
Then, in 1599, his company built one of history's most famous structures, the Globe Theatre, and it sparked a total cultural revolution. Before this, entertainment was highly segregated, but the Globe completely democratized it. Under one open roof, kings and nobles sat right alongside merchants, craftsmen, and ordinary, everyday citizens. This radically affected his writing. Because he had peasants and royals in the exact same room, his plays had to seamlessly weave highbrow philosophical rhetoric with lowbrow dirty jokes just to keep everyone entertained simultaneously. That dual-layer writing is totally his secret sauce.
39. That is the sheer, unbelievable scale of his creative output during his career. Just think about the mental endurance required for that. He wasn't just writing, he was acting, co-managing a theater company, and constantly producing blockbuster after blockbuster for a desperately hungry London audience.
And he didn't just stick to one formula to hit that number. He systematically conquered every single genre. You've got the heart-wrenching tragedies like Hamlet and Macbeth, the hilarious and chaotic comedies like Twelfth Night and A Midsummer Night's Dream, the epic histories like Henry V, exploring power and politics, and finally the romances like The Tempest. By mastering every single one of these categories, Shakespeare explored literally every conceivable facet of the human experience.
And if 39 world-changing plays weren't enough, there's his poetry, 154 sonnets alongside 2 massive narrative poems. Interestingly enough, much of his poetic work was likely written when the theaters were forced to close down due to massive outbreaks of the plague. So while his plays were loud, public spectacles, his sonnets were intimate, deeply personal explorations of love, time, beauty, and mortality.
So how exactly did one person appeal to so many people for so long? Well, his absolute superpower was a profound, unmatched understanding of human nature. Before Shakespeare, theatrical characters were often just one-dimensional archetypes. Shakespeare made them fiercely complex. They wrestled with the exact same love, ambition, paralyzing jealousy, dark revenge, and desperate hope that you and I experience today. He didn't just write about kings and queens, he wrote about what it actually feels like to be human.
To capture that human experience, he needed a revolutionary toolkit. He popularized blank verse, giving his dialogue a natural rhythmic heartbeat that masterfully mimicked human speech. He perfected the soliloquy, essentially inventing the modern character monologue to show us a character's inner psychological turmoil directly. Plus, he layered his work with brilliant symbolism, metaphors, irony, and endless wordplay. He took the basic building blocks of language and elevated them into absolute high art. The result of all this linguistic experimentation is just staggering. Shakespeare didn't just use the English language, he fundamentally shaped modern English. He coined or popularized hundreds of words and expressions that you and I use in our everyday conversations right now. When you talk about a gloomy day, or being in a pickle, or having a heart of gold, you are literally quoting William Shakespeare. How crazy is that? Because his themes were so universal and his language so incredibly powerful, his legacy quickly broke out of England. Today, his works have been translated into more than 100 languages that performed in every corner of the world. No matter the culture, no matter the language barrier, the core human truths that he captured resonate globally with all of us.
In 1616, the defining voice of the English Renaissance passed away. But his cultural timeline was really just beginning. His work continues to be the absolute bedrock of modern storytelling. The tropes he perfected, the star-crossed lovers, the ambitious tyrant descending into madness, the wise fool, they're everywhere. Modern films, best-selling novels, television adaptations, so many of them draw their direct inspiration and sometimes their entire plot lines straight from his foundational stories.
Which leaves us with a truly fascinating question to ponder. If Shakespeare's stories survived over 400 years simply because they acted as a perfect mirror to our own complex emotions, what modern tales being written today are going to achieve this same kind of immortality? Will anything we create now be studied in the year 2400?
It really makes you think about the lasting power of a truly great story. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this explainer on the incredible life of the Bard. Stick around because in our next explainer, we're going to dive directly into his greatest plays to uncover exactly how those timeless themes actually work on the page. I'll see you then.
All right, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to today's explainer, where we're going to explore some of the absolute greatest masterpieces of world literature. We are stepping into the extraordinary, brilliant world of William Shakespeare. So think about this for a second. What actually makes a play immortal? Is it unforgettable characters? Is it the raw, powerful emotions? Maybe timeless themes? Or is it simply stories that somehow just keep speaking to every single generation? Well, William Shakespeare created works that hit every single one of those marks. And today we're going to see exactly how his storytelling achieved true immortality. Here's a quick roadmap for our explainer today. 1. His dramatic universe. 2. The great tragedies. 3. The delightful comedies. 4. The history plays. 5. The late romances. And 6. Why Shakespeare endures today.
Okay, let's start with part 1, Shakespeare's dramatic universe. Over his truly remarkable career, Shakespeare created one of the richest, most complex collections in the history of world literature. 40 plays. I mean, just let that sink in. 40! That is a massive, staggering output for one playwright. So to really make sense of this enormous volume of work, scholars don't just read them chronologically. Instead, they classify them into major groups to wrap their heads around the sheer scope of his genius. And those groups, they're basically the 4 pillars of his dramatic universe: tragedies, comedies, histories, and romances. You can kind of think of these 4 categories as a map to his mind. Each genre explores completely different aspects of life, and together, the whole shebang reflects his completely unparalleled understanding of human emotion. Which brings us to section 2, the great tragedies. Now, these are some of the most serious, intense, and powerful dramatic works ever written. But what exactly makes a tragedy? These aren't just your run-of-the-mill sad stories where bad things happen. A Shakespearean tragedy specifically portrays heroes who are brought down by something internal or inescapable. It's their own personal flaws, a dark fate, or just totally overwhelming circumstances. The absolute defining feature here is that fatal flaw leading to an inevitable downfall. And we are talking about his absolute masterworks here. We have Hamlet, where a young prince struggles with intense doubt while seeking revenge for his father's murder. Then there's Macbeth, the story of a brave Scottish general completely consumed by dark ambition after hearing a prophecy. We've got Othello, where a highly respected commander is destroyed from the inside out by jealousy. And King Lear, where an aging king's terrible decisions lead directly to madness and heartbreaking loss. But here's the thing, these dark plots are actually vessels for universal truths. We're talking power, ambition, guilt, revenge, madness, and the heavy consequences of human choices. These plays absolutely aren't just historical artifacts. They're deeply relevant because they tap right into the core of what it means to be human, and honestly, the devastating mistakes we're all perfectly capable of making. All right, let's lighten things up a bit with section 3, the delightful comedies. So it definitely wasn't all doom and gloom for Shakespeare. Unlike the tragedies we just looked at, his comedies are defined by their joyous, super-energetic nature. These plays celebrate love, wit, and usually feature some hilarious mistaken identities. And the key difference? A comedy almost always concludes with reconciliation, happy endings, and, more often than not, a big marriage to tie the whole thing together in celebration. Some of his most famous comedies are A Midsummer Night's Dream, Twelfth Night, As You Like It, and Much Ado About Nothing. But interestingly enough, The Merchant of Venice is also classified here because of its structure and resolution, even though actually it features some incredibly dark and heavy themes. It just goes to show how much Shakespeare absolutely loved pushing the boundaries of genre. And you should know, these comedies are way more than just a series of 400-year-old jokes. Shakespeare uses humor to make incredibly insightful observations. He essentially combines the laughs with profound looks at friendship, the search for identity, the power of forgiveness, and the super strict rules of society. The humor is really just the vehicle for the truth. Moving right along to section 4, the history plays. This is where Shakespeare looked backward into the past to dramatize the lives of actual English kings.
To really understand a history play, you have to realize that these works beautifully blend real historical events with compelling dramatic storytelling. Basically, Shakespeare took the dry, dusty facts of English history and he molded them to create gripping, stage-worthy drama that would completely captivate an audience. Talk about bringing monarchs to life. We've got Richard II, Richard III, Henry IV, and Henry V. These were the actual historical rulers whose lives, massive medieval battles, and tense royal councils were brought directly to the wooden stage. And by looking at these kings, Shakespeare explored some massive core themes: leadership, patriotism, war, national identity, and the incredibly heavy responsibilities of kingship. He used the past to dig into timeless themes of political power, stuff that literally still resonates in the halls of government today. Now, for Section 5, the late romances. So, as we move toward the very end of his career, we enter this really unique hybrid genre. A romance, at least in the Shakespearean sense, combines the seriousness of a tragedy with elements of total fantasy. These plays heavily emphasize magic, a profound sense of wonder, and ultimately heartwarming family reunions. His most important romances include The Tempest, The Winter's Tale, Cymbeline, and Pericles. These are basically his final beautiful masterpieces. They mark a distinct, profound artistic shift that happened late in his life as a writer. Just contrasts the total doom and destruction of his early tragedies, Hamlet, Macbeth, with these romances. In his final works, the emphasis shifts entirely to hope, redemption, and second chances. It's almost as if, at the very end of his incredible career, he just wanted to leave us with a profound sense of reconciliation and forgiveness. And finally, Section 6, Why Shakespeare Endures Today. So, let's bring it all together and answer that big opening question we asked about immortality. The simple truth, human nature just hasn't changed. People still experience love. We still struggle with ambition. We still face jealousy, fear, loss, and hope. His characters feel so timeless because they perfectly mirror us. His dramatic genius transcends language, culture, and history, which is exactly why it inspires countless translations, films, and adaptations worldwide, even today. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Which Shakespearean genre mirrors your own life right now? Are you in the midst of a complex history, enjoying a delightful comedy? Or maybe you're seeking the hope and second chances of a late romance? Think about that for a bit, and let it inspire you to explore these incredible masterworks for yourself. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. So, when we talk about the absolute peak of English Renaissance drama, there is a massive, unavoidable elephant in the room. Yeah, William Shakespeare. We all know the name, we all know the plays, and it is just so incredibly easy to think of him as this solitary genius, standing alone on an empty stage, inventing modern storytelling all by himself. But who else was there? I mean, if you just look past Shakespeare's towering shadow, you'll discover this entire vibrant world of brilliance. The guy definitely didn't stand alone. In this explainer, we're going to look at the hidden architects who truly expanded the possibilities of the English theater: Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson. These are the playwrights who revolutionized the stage in ways that even Shakespeare had to learn from. Okay, let's dive into this. We'll start by stepping beyond Shakespeare's shadow. Meet the rebel genius Marlowe and explore his masterpiece, Faustus. Then we'll jump over to Jonson, the master of satire. Look at how he exposed society's weaknesses. And finally, we'll wrap up with a tale of two titans.
Section 1. Beyond Shakespeare's Shadow, the Golden Age of English Drama.
To really get a feel for this golden age, picture late 16th century London. It is vibrant, chaotic, loud, and just incredibly exciting. We are witnessing an absolute explosion of theatrical activity here. Permanent, massive stages are popping up for the very first time. Places like the Globe, the Rose, and the Swan. And they are pulling in thousands of everyday spectators every single week. Now, looking at the timeline, the English Renaissance roughly stretches from the year 1500 down to 1660. Right in the thick of it, in 1564, both Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare are born in the exact same year. Just a few years later, in 1572, Ben Jonson arrives on the scene. So these three are contemporaries, stirring the exact same creative pot. But tragically, in 1593, Marlowe's timeline gets cut way short, which, as we'll see, completely shifted the trajectory of English drama forever.
Section 2. Marlowe, the rebel genius. and the master of tragedy. Listen, Christopher Marlowe was an absolute force of nature. Born in that fateful year of 1564, he was this brilliant, Cambridge-educated scholar who basically burst onto the London scene with a bold imagination and a completely revolutionary use of language. His mastery of unrhymed iambic pentameter, blank verse, it absolutely floored England. He took what was honestly a pretty clunky poetic form at the time and made it soar. He set a brand new gold standard for what a play could actually sound like. But here is the heartbreaking reality. 29. That is how incredibly young Marlowe was when his intensely emotional, deeply philosophical career ended abruptly. He died in 1593 at just 29 years old. But man, in that incredibly short, explosive window, he left behind a literary legacy that permanently altered the DNA of dramatic storytelling. He introduced a concept that really defines his legacy, the overreaching hero. We're talking about a character driven by extraordinary, almost superhuman ambition. They deliberately push past moral and religious boundaries, dreaming way, way beyond ordinary human limits. But as with all great drama, their immense pride almost always leads to their total destruction. It kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? If you were handed the opportunity, how far would you personally go? What lines would you be willing to cross to achieve ultimate power?
Section 3, Dr. Faustus and Ultimate Ambition, the Ultimate Demonic Pact.
We actually see that exact provocative question pushed to its absolute terrifying limits in Marlowe's masterpiece, a play called Dr. Faustus. This is the perfect place to see this overreaching hero archetype in full, horrifying action. The plot basically reads like a high-stakes supernatural thriller. It starts with Dr. Faustus, a brilliant scholar who becomes utterly dissatisfied with ordinary knowledge. Regular books just aren't cutting it anymore. He wants unlimited power and wisdom. So step 2, he goes all in and makes a literal deal with the devil. He promises to surrender his soul in exchange for a 24-year demonic pact. Step 3, for a while, it is fantastic. He gains unimaginable wealth, fame, incredible magical powers. The guy is living the ultimate dream. But the clock is always ticking. Step 4 is inevitable. The 24 years eventually run out. Fear and desperate regret completely consume him, and he is dragged screaming into eternal damnation. Marlowe isn't just telling a scary story to entertain a crowd here, right? He is asking really deep philosophical questions. Can knowledge actually exist without morality? Is redemption always possible? Or can you step too far past the line of no return? Through Faustus, Marlowe explored the absolute, terrifying limits of human ambition, basically holding up a dark mirror to the Renaissance era's own obsession with rapid learning and unchecked power.
Section 4, Jonson, Master of Satire, the King of Jacobean Comedy.
Now, Ben Jonson took the exact opposite route. If Marlowe was all about grand tragedy and romantic, doomed heroes reaching for the stars, Jonson pointed his witty lens directly downwards at the gritty, everyday, relatable weaknesses of ordinary people. Born in 1572, his highly educated perspective birthed a core philosophy, the comedy of humors. This is a fascinating psychological concept that Jonson essentially pioneered for the stage. The theory suggests that every single person is dominated by a particular temperament or an obsession that drives absolutely everything they do. Think about the people you know, or hey, even yourself. What's your dominant obsession? Is it ambition, vanity, greed, maybe a wildly quick temper? Jonson brilliantly built his entire comedic structure around this idea of unbalanced human nature.
Section 5. Exposing society's weaknesses, greed, vanity, and fraud.
Jonson used this theory of humors to hold a harsh and honestly hilarious mirror up to his audience. Instead of kings and brilliant scholars, his plays featured wealthy merchants, street-level tricksters, and complete fools. This allowed him to sharply expose the rampant hypocrisy and everyday foolishness of his era. Let's run through a few of his greatest hits to see this in action. First up, Volpone. This play is about a wealthy man who literally fakes his own death, for one very specific reason, just to trick his incredibly greedy relatives into showering him with gifts as they compete for his inheritance. It is a masterful, biting satire on extreme greed. Then you have The Alchemist, where 3 clever fraudsters set up shop to deceive wealthy, gullible citizens with totally fake promises of magical wealth, a hilarious take on human foolishness and blind ambition. And of course, Every Man in His Humor, the play that famously introduced his whole dominant trait theory to the public. Jonson weaponized satire so perfectly to critique the corrupt, money-obsessed culture of his time, constantly pushing his audience to reflect on their own behavior.
Finally, Section 6, A Tale of Two Titans, Tragedy versus Comedy.
So these two men were writing in the exact same English Renaissance, breathing the same creative air, and competing for the exact same crowds. Yet the dichotomy here is epic. Now, what's really interesting here is the stark contrast. Marlowe gives us soaring, grand tragedy with Dr. Faustus. Jonson gives us sharp, biting comedy with Volpone. Marlowe writes in majestic, poetic blank verse. Jonson cuts deep with relentless satire. Marlowe creates these larger-than-life heroic characters, while Jonson focuses intently on ordinary people. It is the ultimate contrast of grand, dark ambition against foolish, gritty human weakness. They were literally two completely different sides of the same brilliant theatrical coin.
The core takeaway from all this is that the English Renaissance is just so much richer than the works of William Shakespeare alone. By pushing the boundaries of what tragic ambition could look like on stage, Marlowe elevated the medium to the heavens. And by exposing the everyday absurdities of human greed and vanity, Jonson grounded it perfectly in reality. Together, they vastly expanded the artistic possibilities of the theater, elevating English drama into one of the greatest, most enduring literary traditions in human history.
So I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. When you look at the world around you today, which of these two titans really got it right? I mean, which reflects our true nature more accurately? Grand, tragic ambition, or everyday, foolish greed? Let that sink in. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and be sure to catch our next one where we'll step off the theater stage and into the world of poetry and prose to explore Edmund Spenser, Sir Philip Sidney, and Francis Bacon. Keep exploring, keep learning, and I will see you next time.
All right, let's jump straight in. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into one of the most incredible periods of intellectual awakening in human history, the English Renaissance. Now, when most of us hear English Renaissance, our minds instantly go to those packed wooden theaters, the dramatic actors, and, the brilliant playwrights of the time. But the literary revolution that was unfolding back then went way, way beyond the stage. Today, we're going to explore the master architects who built an entirely different, but equally massive, side of this cultural explosion.
Okay, let's dive into this. Was the English Renaissance just Shakespeare? It's a surprisingly common misconception that this whole era was built solely by playwrights, but outside those theater walls, it was a wild, multifaceted awakening. There were brilliant poets crafting these magnificent, sweeping verses that celebrated beauty and imagination. There were deep thinkers who were aggressively challenging old superstitions and pushing for pure reason. And there were essayists transforming prose itself into a sharp, practical tool. So no, it definitely wasn't just Shakespeare.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look beyond the theaters. Then we've got Spenser, the poet's poet, Sidney, the ideal gentleman, and Bacon, father of English prose. After that, we'll be comparing poetry and prose, and finally wrapping up with a lasting literary legacy.
Section 1. Beyond the theaters.
So, we're focusing on three distinct archetypes who were basically the engine of this literary revolution: a master poet, an ideal gentleman, and a pragmatic philosopher. Together, this trio drove a massive shift in how people thought and wrote. I mean, they celebrated the absolute limits of human imagination, they bravely challenged things people just blindly accepted, and they championed reason in a way that had literally never been seen before in the English language.
Section 2. Spenser, the poet's poet. Meet Edmund Spenser. Born around 1552, he eventually became one of Queen Elizabeth I's absolute favorite writers. And how did he pull that off? By being a master of allegorical poetry. In his incredibly ambitious giant epic called The Faerie Queene, Spenser didn't just sit there preaching morality to his readers. Actually, scratch that, he did teach morality, but he disguised these deep, complex virtues, holiness, temperance, chastity, justice, friendship, and courtesy, as thrilling adventures. We're talking noble knights and magical creatures. It was the ultimate Renaissance masterpiece, a moral guidebook wrapped in high fantasy, which doubled as a massive, flattering celebration of Queen Elizabeth, who he symbolically cast as Gloriana, the Faerie Queene herself. And this brilliantly illustrates how innovative he was. He didn't just write great poetry, he basically invented a brand new linguistic architecture to tell his stories. It's called the Spenserian stanza. It's a really specific 9-line structure. He'd take 8 lines of standard iambic pentameter, but then, and here's the genius part, he added this sweeping, elongated 9th line, an Alexandrine, written in iambic hexameter. You combine that with this complex interlocking AB, AB, BC, BCC rhyme scheme, and it creates this incredibly hypnotic, almost musical rhythm. It gave his work this majestic grandeur that completely elevated English poetry.
Section 3. Sidney, the ideal gentleman.
Now, just a couple of years after Spenser, in 1554, Sir Philip Sidney is born. And this guy, he completely embodied the Renaissance ideal. He was a scholar, a diplomat, a soldier, the whole shebang. But in his famous work, An Apology for Poetry, Sidney makes this revolutionary argument. He says poetry doesn't just entertain us, it actively inspires us to become wiser and more virtuous. He was essentially stepping into the ring as the very first major literary critic in English, fiercely defending literature against cynics who called it a frivolous, even sinful waste of time. He locked in the idea that literature has to both delight and educate.
Sidney was also a massive champion of Renaissance humanism. This was that profound intellectual shift away from just focusing strictly on the divine afterlife and instead looking at human potential, reason, and classical learning right here on Earth. We see this brilliantly executed in his work Astrophil and Stella. It's one of England's earliest and finest sonnet sequences. Through elegant language, he deeply explored very human themes: love, intense longing, emotional conflict. He really brought a whole new psychological depth to English verse.
Section 4. Bacon, father of English prose.
So, the crucial point is Francis Bacon's overwhelming resume. Born in 1561, Bacon didn't just have one career, he lived about 5 lifetimes in one. Philosopher, statesman, lawyer, scientist, and, yeah, the father of the English essay. While Spenser and Sidney were up in the clouds elevating poetry and imagination, Bacon was leading a hard, pragmatic shift down on earth toward logic and reason. He was at the center of a movement that stripped away all that flowery language and transformed prose into a sharp, practical tool for relentless discovery.
Let's walk through his radical new empirical method, because it's a real game changer. Step 1. Reject blind tradition. In an era where people basically accepted ancient texts as unquestionable truth, throwing that out the window was a massive intellectual earthquake. Step 2. Use careful observation of the natural world. And Step 3. Conduct rigorous scientific experimentation. By prioritizing tangible, repeatable proof over old superstitions, Bacon literally laid the absolute groundwork for modern science.
But to share this radical new way of thinking, Bacon needed a completely new vehicle. Enter his collection, simply titled Essays. This introduced a concise, stripped-down, incredibly practical style of writing. He totally abandoned the decorative, wandering verse of his peers and went straight for direct, accessible language that delivered hard truths. Works of his like Of Studies and Of Truth cut right to the core of human behavior. And honestly, they remain highly influential today because of that exact laser-like clarity.
Section 5. Comparing Poetry and Prose.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how vividly it contrasts these two halves of the Renaissance mind. It's a fascinating duality. On one side, you have poetry, championed by Spenser and Sidney, relying heavily on imagination and verse to explore beauty and emotion. Then, on the totally opposite side, you have Baconian prose, using strict observation and the essay format to lock down logic and reason. They seem completely opposed, right? But together, they perfectly hit the nail on the head of the era's ultimate belief, that words, whether in a soaring stanza or a tightly argued essay, must absolutely inspire the soul and educate the mind.
Section 6. A lasting literary legacy.
It's honestly mind-blowing to step back and realize that this massive explosion of thought didn't happen centuries apart. From epic allegorical poetry to the strict scientific method, this all happened at once. Born in 1552, 1554, and 1561, these architects existed in overlapping lifetimes. They were breathing the exact same air, walking the same London streets, and feeding off the very same cultural awakening that was rapidly yanking England right out of the Middle Ages.
And their echoes? They're absolutely still ringing today. Spenser's majestic verse became the blueprint for later romantic titans, guys like John Keats and Alfred Lord Tennyson. Sidney's fierce intellectual defenses built the very foundation of modern literary criticism. And Bacon's insistence on clarity and observation, well, that helped birth the modern scientific world we live in right now. Their achievements completely transcended their own era.
But hey, our Renaissance journey doesn't stop here. Coming up next in our Explainer series, we're diving into religious literature. We'll discover how the King James Bible, just one singular translation, managed to change the English language forever. You definitely won't want to miss that one.
Before you go, though, I want to leave you with this thought. The English Renaissance reached its absolute peak because it struck this perfect balance between Spenserian imagination and Baconian logic. So, looking at our world today, which force do you think is in the driver's seat? Are we anchored entirely in empirical data and observation, or is human imagination still charting the course of our future? Think about that balance. See you in the next Explainer.
Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled you're joining us today because, well, we're doing something just a little bit different. we're going to take a 400-year-old text and completely reframe it. Now, usually we think of the specific book purely as a religious work, right? A sacred text. But today, we're putting on a totally different lens. We're going to examine it as the foundational blueprint of our everyday language. Yep, I'm talking about the King James Bible, published way back in 1611, and how it literally constructed the architecture of modern English as we know it.
But before we even get into all the history, I want you to ask yourself a quick question. Just think about the vocabulary you use every single week. When you're at work, reading the news, or just chatting with a friend over coffee, where do our everyday phrases actually come from? We throw around so many idioms and expressions without ever really stopping to think about who strung those specific words together for the very first time. It's kind of a mystery, isn't it? Language feels like this totally organic thing that just exists, but actually many of the specific structural phrases we use were deliberately, painstakingly crafted. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that if you've ever used or even just heard any of these phrases, the powers that be, the salt of the earth, the writing on the wall, or maybe calling someone the apple of his eye, you are directly quoting the 1611 King James Bible. Seriously. These aren't just random historical artifacts. They're living, breathing pieces of a 4th-century-old literary masterpiece that we are literally walking around saying every single day.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for the explainer. First, an era of religious change. Then, crafting the King James Bible, the beauty of the language, a look at other Renaissance religious writers, and finally, a lasting literary legacy. Let's get moving.
Starting us off with Section 1, an era of religious change, focusing on the English Reformation.
So to really understand this book, we have to look at the brisk, turbulent, and frankly pretty confusing historical catalyst that made a single, unified text absolutely necessary in Renaissance England. Let's walk through this timeline together because it moves fast and it changes literally everything. Back in the early 1500s, you've got King Henry VIII separating England from the Roman Catholic Church. This English Reformation sparked a massive shift, meaning religious worship was suddenly encouraged to be in English instead of Latin. Then, moving into the mid-1500s, scholars like William Tyndale started translating scripture directly into English to make it accessible to everyday people. But here's the rub. This created a wildly confusing mix of different English translations just floating around. So when King James I ascends the throne in 1603, he surveys this fragmented landscape and realizes, for the sake of unity, England desperately needs one single authoritative version for both the church and for public life. And that specific vision brings us to Section 2, crafting the King James Bible in a true crucible of creation.
This definitely wasn't just some casual weekend translation project. It was an incredibly meticulous, highly collaborative undertaking. To give you an idea of the sheer scale of what King James set in motion in 1604, consider the number 50. He appointed a massive team of approximately 50 of the absolute greatest scholars from Oxford, Cambridge, and Westminster. These incredible minds were brought together, and they dedicated 7 grueling years of their lives to this one single project before it was finally published in 1611. And their approach was genuinely fascinating. They didn't just sit down and write a brand new translation from scratch. Instead, they went all the way back to the original source materials, ancient texts in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. But they also built upon those earlier English versions, like Tyndale's that we just mentioned. You see, their goal wasn't just raw, literal accuracy. Obviously, they wanted clarity, but they were specifically aiming for unmatched literary beauty. They wanted to refine these ancient texts into a style that was majestic, memorable, and most importantly, meant to be spoken aloud.
Which naturally leads us right into Section 3, the beauty of the language, exploring its rhythmic and poetic prose.
This is where the text completely transcends religion and becomes a true literary masterpiece. We need to look at the exact literary architecture that makes this text work so perfectly in the human ear. So the crucial point is that one of the scholars' primary tools for this was parallelism. That's the use of successive verbal constructions that correspond in grammatical structure, sound, meter, or meaning. The scholars heavily utilized this, along with repetition, deep symbolism, and vivid metaphor. By structuring the text this way, they weren't just conveying information. They were creating deeply expressive phrasing that practically locked itself into the listener's memory. It has this cadence that just feels incredibly satisfying to say. And that incredibly satisfying poetic rhythm is exactly why we still use these phrases today. Think about it. The powers that be, a thorn in the flesh, the salt of the earth, the writing on the wall, the apple of his eye. The vivid imagery and rhythmic structure applied by those 50 scholars embedded these phrases so deeply into our English language that they have survived for over 400 years. This is exactly why you're still seeing these precise words in today's newspapers, in modern political speeches, and in everyday conversations all over the world.
Moving right along to Section 4, other Renaissance religious writers who were shaping English religion and prose. Now, as unbelievably influential as it was, the King James Bible didn't just exist in a vacuum. The Renaissance produced a much broader, vibrant ecosystem of writers who were simultaneously shaping the era's English religion and its prose. Three major figures really stand out here. First up, we have William Tyndale, who we talked about earlier. He translated the New Testament into English, acting as the crucial foundation for later translations. Next is John Foxe. His work, Foxe's Book of Martyrs, recorded the histories of Protestant martyrs and honestly became one of the most widely read books in all of England. Finally, we have Richard Hooker, who wrote Of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. His work was absolutely instrumental in defending the structure of the Church of England and profoundly influenced Anglican thought. Together, these writers laid the bedrock for English prose and religious thought during the Renaissance.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, a lasting literary legacy, tracing the expanding ripples of this text. And this brilliantly illustrates the incredible expanding ripple effect the text had on centuries of subsequent world literature. You can trace its influence directly to absolute literary giants like John Milton, John Bunyan, William Blake, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Charles Dickens, and T.S. Eliot. You can literally thread the needle from the quills of those 50 scholars in 1611 directly into the symbolic frameworks and moral imaginations of these legendary authors. The language of the King James Bible just echoes through their works. Even Shakespeare's audiences were steeped in this evolving biblical vocabulary and its incredibly powerful expressions. To really summarize its legacy, the King James Bible essentially standardized a modern English prose and vocabulary. It enriched our language so far beyond its religious origins. It inspired countless writers, shaped the way public speaking is structured, influenced our education, and preserved these beautiful poetic expressions that still feel entirely familiar to us right now, at this very moment. Seriously, few books in human history have ever contributed more to the actual mechanics and beauty of the English language. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to ponder. What modern book could possibly shape the next 400 years of human language? It's kind of wild to think about the sheer power of language and how a unified pursuit of literary beauty can echo through so many centuries. I really hope you've enjoyed reframing this historic text with me today. And hey, our journey through Renaissance literature is far from over. In our next explainer, we're going to dive into some massive cultural themes of the era, like humanism, individualism, and the spirit of discovery. You definitely won't want to miss it. See you then.
Welcome to This Explainer. Let's just dive right into this, shall we? The Renaissance wasn't just some dusty historical era, it was a total psychological earthquake. I mean, imagine waking up and realizing the entire center of the universe had suddenly shifted from the heavens directly into your own mind. In a matter of decades, this massive, dramatic revolution completely rewired how humanity thought, learned, created, and understood the entire world.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the shift to humanism, look at the rise of the self through individualism, and explore the rebirth of ancient wisdom. After that, we'll examine the duality of man, open up the architect's toolkit, and finally look at the Renaissance legacy.
All right, Section 1, The Shift, Humanism. To truly grasp why this was such a massive intellectual earthquake, we kind of have to look at what came right before it. For centuries, medieval literature was almost entirely locked in on religion and the afterlife. That was the rigid lens for literally everything. But then, boom, a total paradigm shift. Attention pivots squarely onto humanity, the pursuit of knowledge, and individual potential. It was as if someone finally flipped on the lights in a completely dark room.
And this brings us to the beating heart of the era, humanism. Now, this was an intellectual movement that emphasized the absolute value, dignity, and potential of human beings. Renaissance thinkers didn't just abandon faith, but they did start deeply studying history, philosophy, ethics, and classical languages. They believed that education could actually improve individuals and society right here, right now. Writers you know well, like William Shakespeare, Edmund Spenser, and Sir Philip Sidney, they took this humanist philosophy and used it to map out the profound complexity of the human experience.
Moving to Section 2, The Rise of the Self, Individualism.
Because think about it, once you genuinely believe humans have this vast potential, you naturally start focusing intensely on the individual. The crucial realization here was that individual choices actually shape human destiny. Before this, destiny was largely seen as a script that was already written, totally out of your hands. But in the Renaissance, people were encouraged to develop their own talents, pursue knowledge, and actually author their own lives. So suddenly, literature is just bursting with these unforgettable characters, struggling with very personal ambition, identity, and morality. I mean, think of Hamlet, agonizing over his ultimate purpose, or Prince Hal navigating his own freedom. It's a real game changer.
Which brings us to Section 3, Rebirth of Ancient Wisdom, Classicism.
So where did these supposed new ideas actually come from? Well, the incredible irony of this great forward leap is that it actually required looking backward. Seriously, think about this. Renaissance thinkers essentially bypassed 1,000 years of the Middle Ages just to connect directly with Homer in 8th century BC Greece and writers like Virgil and Ovid in 1st century BC Rome. And they didn't just read them, right? They intensely studied them. They wanted to borrow the balance, the logic, and the harmony of antiquity. Ultimately, they were using the deep past as a direct blueprint to build the future.
Okay, Section 4, the duality of man, love, nature, and ambition. Because once you put humanity at the center of the universe, you really have to look at the whole picture, starting with the brilliant light. Romantic love, friendship, and devotion became the most celebrated subjects in literature. Meanwhile, nature, it transformed from this static, kind of boring background into a living, breathing symbol of harmony and renewal. Just picture the magical, transformative forest in Shakespeare's comedies. Ultimately, experiencing this physical and spiritual beauty acted as a direct pathway to understanding humanity itself. It was an incredibly optimistic worldview. But, there is definitely a darker side to this newfound freedom. The big question became, what happens when human ambition goes completely unchecked? If we have this incredible power to shape our own destiny, what happens when we make the wrong choices? So while they absolutely celebrated human greatness, Renaissance writers were deeply and often painfully aware of human pride and moral conflict.
These darker themes were anchored in characters we're literally still obsessing over today. You've got Dr. Faustus desiring limitless knowledge, which leads to the ultimate corruption, sacrificing his own soul just to win a cosmic bet. Then there's Macbeth. His craving for power unleashes a blinding ambition that completely destroys his kingdom and his conscience. And Richard III's thirst for the throne, that drives him to pure, unadulterated manipulation. These writers were sending a very clear, potent warning to their audience. Intelligence without morality is absolutely lethal.
All right, Section 5, the Architect's Toolkit, Literary Characteristics. So how did they actually construct these masterpieces? The technical innovation was just staggering. We're talking blank verse, sonnets, realism infused with actual messy psychological depth. The writers of this era were experimenting wildly with language, utilizing incredibly rich imagery and diving deep into complex human emotions, all while meticulously maintaining that classical harmony they admired so much. They sought to entertain for sure, but equally they wanted to educate and inspire their audience through sheer artistic brilliance.
Finally, Section 6, the Renaissance Legacy. You might be wondering, why are we still unpacking a movement from 500 years ago? Well, it's because the Renaissance was not simply an age of literature, it was an age of intellectual awakening. It was the exact moment humanity really learned to question, to imagine, to create, and to understand itself using reason without having to abandon faith. And that awakening has a massive, ongoing influence over our world right now. From modern novels to cinema and theater, right down to our very systems of education, the humanism, the artistic creativity, and that relentless pursuit of knowledge from the 1500s are the foundational structures supporting the media you consume and the philosophy you discuss today. It quite literally transformed the entire course of the modern mind.
So I'll leave you with this final thought. If the Renaissance awakened our limitless potential, how are you shaping your own destiny today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and I'll catch you next time. Welcome back, everyone. Okay, we have finally made it. Today, we're diving into the 10th and final explainer of our series on the English Renaissance. And wow, we've spent an incredible amount of time exploring an era that didn't just change a single nation, but fundamentally transformed how humanity thought, how we wrote, how we imagined, and really how we understood ourselves. I mean, this is the era that gave English literature a brand new language of beauty and creativity. There's a great saying that every great era leaves behind a legacy. But the Renaissance did something even greater. We aren't just looking back at some dusty, forgotten history today. Not at all. We are exploring the very foundation of a completely new language of reason and human experience, one that crossed continents and, frankly, continues to shape our modern world today. It's a legacy that never truly died.
All right, let's jump straight in. Section 1, An Era Evolves.
Now, you might be wondering, did this legendary golden age just abruptly disappear overnight? Absolutely not. It was more of a ripple effect. If we start right around the year 1500, we can see how the ideas born during the Renaissance seamlessly transitioned, kind of like passing a baton, right, into the metaphysical age around 1600. Then came the Puritan age in 1625, the Restoration in 1660, and right on into the neoclassical age by 1700. The point here is that every single literary age that followed inherited something profound from the Renaissance. Its influence never vanished, it just adapted and kept growing.
Moving on to Section 2, the Literary Revolution.
So what actually changed on the ground? Well, it completely transformed English literature by giving birth to entirely new forms. We're talking about drama suddenly flourishing, bringing these incredibly complex stories to life on stage in a way nobody had ever seen before. At the exact same time, you had poets perfecting the highly structured, just unbelievably beautiful sonnet, while other writers experimented with the total freedom of blank verse. And alongside this massive artistic explosion, we saw the rise of literary criticism and the immense growth of the English essay. This rapid-fire sequence of innovations literally became the rock-solid foundation of the modern English literature we still study today.
Which brings us to Section 3, Titans of Text.
You can't have a revolution without revolutionaries, right? To truly understand these innovations, we have to look at the heavyweights who actually drove them. Take William Shakespeare, for example. The era's greatest dramatist, a guy who pushed the absolute boundaries of human emotion, or Edmund Spenser, the master of allegorical poetry, who mapped out these vast, deeply symbolic worlds. And then you have Christopher Marlowe, who gave us the dark, ambitious blueprint for the tragic, overreaching hero. Each of these writers took the rulebook, tore it up, and created entirely new blueprints for drama, poetry, and tragedy that the rest of the world would eventually follow.
But the sheer diversity of output was just staggering. Beyond tragedy and allegorical poetry, you had Ben Jonson pioneering satirical comedy with this sharp, unforgettable edge. You had Sir Philip Sidney laying the crucial groundwork for literary criticism itself, literally teaching us how to evaluate writing. And Francis Bacon, who championed empirical thinking and birthed the English essay. From biting satire to groundbreaking scientific philosophy, their works remain absolutely central to literary studies in universities across the globe.
Let's move on to Section 4, Ideas Shaping Our World.
You see, it wasn't just about the physical books and plays. These texts sparked massive philosophical shifts, starting with humanism. This right here was the beating heart of the era, a deep respect for human dignity, for our personal potential, and the supreme value placed on education. This wasn't just some artistic movement. It was a fundamental shift in how people valued human life and the incredible capacity of the human mind to learn and grow.
And naturally, that deep respect gave rise to individualism. Renaissance writers championed this steadfast belief in personal growth, self-reliance, and individual responsibility. It was a bold declaration that you, yes you, as an individual, have the power to shape your own destiny and take responsibility for your actions in the world.
Now, once you have that sense of individual empowerment, what happens next? Boom, scientific curiosity. There was this sudden active encouragement to observe nature, to actually dare to question accepted beliefs and investigate the world strictly through reason and evidence. I mean, actively questioning the world and challenging accepted norms through critical thinking, that was a truly revolutionary concept at the time. It was quite literally the birth of the modern scientific mindset.
All right, Section 5, the Modern Renaissance.
Now, you might be asking yourself, why does any of this matter centuries later? Because our modern world is built directly on these 16th century roots. Think about it. Shakespeare's plays directly inspire the huge global film and television adaptations we binge-watch every single weekend. Francis Bacon's empirical wisdom, that forms the very foundation of modern university research and investigation. And the deeply influential prose of the King James Bible still echoes everywhere in our everyday modern literature. The timeless themes they explored back then, things like love, ambition, justice, identity, morality, they are the exact same themes driving our culture today. The Renaissance is entirely alive right now, whether we're at the cinema, sitting in classrooms, or just having a casual conversation.
And finally, Section 6, the Golden Age concludes. Over this 10-part explainer series, we have really been on quite the epic journey together.
Just think about what we've covered, from the initial birth of the era and the Tudor dynasty, through brilliant poetry, Shakespeare's life, and his greatest plays. We explored the sheer genius of Marlowe, Jonson, Spenser, Sidney, and Bacon. We discussed the monumental impact of the King James Bible, unpacked the core themes of the era, and synthesized its lasting legacy. Together, this incredible sequence of milestones reveals exactly why this period is universally remembered as the absolute golden age of English literature.
Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the Renaissance was a celebration of imagination, of knowledge, of reason, and of humanity's absolute limitless potential. It transformed not just a language, but the very way literature reflects the human experience.
Which leaves us with one final fascinating thought. As the Golden Age sets, what brilliant mysteries will the metaphysical age reveal next? In our next Explainer series, we're going to move forward chronologically to the year 1600, where writers like John Donne open a completely new, incredibly complex, and mysterious chapter in the story of English literature. The journey of knowledge never truly ends, you guys. It just evolves. Thank you so much for exploring with me. Keep questioning, and I will see you in the next era.